My ex-mother-in-law accused me of using her poor son's money to take my child on vacation. So I sent her 2 screenshots that destroyed her entire narrative and exposed the truth she didn't want to face. What happened next tore their family apart and finally set me free from their toxic manipulation. My name is Hadley, I'm 35 years old, and this is the story of how I learned to stop being everyone else's doormat and finally stood up for myself and my son. Looking back now, I can see all the red flags I ignored when I first met Blake 8 years ago. We were both in our late 20s, working at the same marketing firm in downtown Portland. He was charming, funny, and seemed to have his life together. What I didn't realize then was how deeply enmeshed he was with his parents, particularly his mother, Francine. She had opinions about everything in his life, from the clothes he wore to the food he ate, and unfortunately, that control extended to our relationship from day one. Our first few months were magical. Blake would take me to cozy little restaurants in the Pearl District, and we'd spend hours talking about our dreams and plans for the future. He wanted to start his own consulting business someday, and I was working toward my master's degree in communications. We seemed perfectly matched, both ambitious and ready to build something beautiful together. When he proposed after 2 years of dating, I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world. The wedding planning should have been my first major warning sign. Francine inserted herself into every decision, from the venue to the color of the napkins. She'd call me multiple times a week with suggestions that were really demands in disguise. When I mentioned wanting a small, intimate ceremony, she gasped as if I'd suggested something scandalous. "Oh honey, that won't do at all," she said during one particularly memorable phone call. "The Morrison family is well respected in this community. We simply cannot have a tiny wedding. What would people think?" Blake always sided with his mother. "She just wants what's best for us, Hadley. She's been planning this moment since I was a little boy." I should have realized then that I wasn't marrying just Blake. I was marrying into a family where his mother's word was law, and my opinions would always come second. But I was young and in love, so I convinced myself that things would change once we were married and had our own space. Our son, Wesley, was born 3 years into our marriage. Those early months were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy, but even that sacred time was invaded by Francine. She'd show up unannounced with bags of baby clothes she'd picked out, criticizing everything from how I was feeding Wesley to the way I'd decorated his nursery. "That's not how we did things in my day," became her constant refrain. Blake would just shrug and say his mother was trying to help. I felt like a stranger in my own home, constantly walking on eggshells to avoid another confrontation. The first real crack in our marriage appeared when Wesley was about 2 years old. I'd gotten a promotion at work that required some travel, and instead of being proud of my achievement, Blake was resentful. He complained that I was abandoning my family and suggested I should turn down the opportunity to focus on being a proper mother. "Mom thinks it's too much stress on Wesley," he said one evening after I'd returned from a 3-day business trip. "Maybe she's right. Maybe you should consider something more flexible." That was the moment I realized I'd married a man who saw me as an extension of his mother's vision rather than as an individual with my own dreams and ambitions. The arguments became more frequent, and Blake increasingly turned to Francine for support, sharing intimate details of our marriage that should have stayed private. The final straw came during Wesley's 5th birthday party. I'd spent weeks planning a perfect celebration in our backyard, complete with a bounce house and all of his little friends from kindergarten. Everything was going beautifully until Francine decided to give a speech that was really a thinly veiled attack on my parenting. "I'm so grateful that Wesley has such a strong male role model in his father," she announced to the gathered parents. "It's so important for boys to have that stability, especially when they have working mothers." The way she said working mothers made it sound like a disease. I felt every eye in the backyard turn to me, and the humiliation burned in my chest like acid. Blake didn't say a word to defend me. He just stood there, nodding along as his mother systematically undermined me in front of our friends and neighbors. That night, after all the guests had gone home and Wesley was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table and finally admitted to myself what I'd been denying for years. This marriage was over. I couldn't spend the rest of my life being belittled and controlled by a woman who saw me as competition for her son's attention, and I couldn't stay with a man who was too weak to stand up for his own wife. The divorce process was brutal. Blake seemed genuinely shocked that I wanted to end our marriage, as if years of his mother's interference and his own emotional absence had been perfectly normal. Francine, predictably, blamed me entirely for breaking up the family, and made sure everyone in their social circle knew that I was the villain in this story. "She's being selfish," I overheard her telling someone on the phone during one of my final visits to collect my belongings. "That poor boy is devastated, and she doesn't even care. All she thinks about is herself and her career." The custody arrangement was the one thing Blake didn't fight me on, probably because the reality of being a single parent scared him. We agreed on shared custody, with Wesley spending weekdays with me and weekends with his father. What we couldn't agree on was child support. Blake had always been financially irresponsible, despite making decent money. He'd spend his paychecks on expensive gadgets and weekend trips with his friends, then come to me when he couldn't make his car payment. After the divorce, he seemed to think that his financial obligations to Wesley would somehow magically disappear. For months, I tried to handle things informally. I'd send him texts reminding him about Wesley's school fees, medical expenses, and basic living costs, but he'd always have an excuse. His rent had gone up. His car needed repairs. He was between jobs. Meanwhile, I was covering everything myself while working full-time and trying to maintain some semblance of stability for our son. The breaking point came when Wesley needed new school uniforms and supplies for the beginning of second grade. The total cost was around $300, which should have been split between us. I texted Blake asking for his half, and his response was a masterpiece of deflection. "Things are really tight right now, Hadley. Can't you just handle it this time? I'll get you back next month." Next month never came. There was always another excuse, another crisis that somehow made it impossible for him to contribute to his own son's care. I realized I needed to make this official before Wesley suffered any more than he already had. That's when I decided to contact the child maintenance service. A year had passed since our separation, and I was tired of being the only one shouldering the financial responsibility for our child. It felt like admitting defeat, but I knew it was the right thing to do for Wesley's future. The CMS process was straightforward but emotionally draining. They required financial information from both parents and would calculate a fair amount based on Blake's income and our custody arrangement. I filled out all the paperwork, provided bank statements and pay stubs, and waited for the official assessment to arrive. When the document finally came in the mail, I felt a mix of relief and vindication. The calculated amount was reasonable and fair, based on Blake's reported income at the time. It wasn't going to make me rich, but it would help cover Wesley's basic needs and show that both parents were contributing to his upbringing. I barely had time to process the information before my phone started ringing. It was Francine, and she was not happy. "Hadley, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This whole child support thing is getting out of hand. Blake's father and I have been discussing it, and we think it would be better if you could work something out privately." I was confused. Work what out privately? The CMS already calculated a fair amount based on his income. "Yes, but those amounts are so high," she continued. "We're thinking maybe you could accept something smaller, something more manageable for Blake. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, if you know what I mean." I knew exactly what she meant. She wanted me to accept less money in exchange for avoiding the official system, which would likely mean irregular payments and constant negotiations. I'd been down that road before. "I appreciate your concern, Francine, but I prefer to keep things official. This way, everyone knows what's expected, and there's accountability." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Well, I think you're making a mistake. Sometimes it's better to be flexible than to be rigid. You might end up with nothing at all." Her words turned out to be prophetic, but not in the way she intended. Blake received the official child support order and promptly ignored it. Week after week passed with no payments. I kept detailed records, hoping that he would come to his senses and start fulfilling his legal obligation to his son. Instead, Blake lost his job about 3 months after the order was issued. Whether he was actually laid off or quit to avoid paying child support, I'll never know. But the result was the same. The CMS recalculated his obligation based on unemployment benefits, and the amount dropped to around $30 per week. Even that reduced amount was apparently too much for Blake to manage. The payments never came. Not $30, not $15, not even $5. Nothing. Meanwhile, Wesley needed clothes, food, school supplies, and medical care. I was covering everything alone while Blake played video games in his parents' basement. The CMS eventually stepped in with enforcement action. They started deducting money directly from any income Blake received, adding collection fees that made his total debt even higher. This is when Francine's attitude shifted from annoying to openly hostile. She called me one evening, clearly agitated. "This has gone too far, Hadley. Do you realize how much Blake owes now with all these fees? You're destroying his credit and his future." "I'm not destroying anything," I replied calmly. "He's destroying his own credit by refusing to support his son. The fees are a consequence of his choice not to pay voluntarily." "But you could stop this anytime," she insisted. "You could call them off and work something out with us directly. We know you don't really need the money. You have a good job." That comment revealed everything I needed to know about how Blake's family viewed this situation. They thought child support was some kind of optional gift from the father, not a legal obligation to provide for his child. They acted as if I was being greedy by expecting Blake to contribute to Wesley's upbringing. Whether I need the money or not isn't the point, I told her. This is about Wesley having two parents who are both responsible for his care. Blake chose to have a child, and that comes with financial responsibilities. Francine huffed in frustration. Well, I just think you're being unreasonable. But mark my words, this is going to backfire on you. I should have realized then that she was planning something. Francine wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and I'd just made it clear that I wasn't going to back down. What I didn't expect was how petty and vindictive her next move would be. A few months later, Wesley's 8th birthday was approaching. He'd been asking about visiting a theme park he'd seen advertised on television, and I decided to make it happen. I'd been saving money for months, working extra hours when possible, and cutting back on my own expenses to afford a special trip for his birthday. The park was about 4 hours away, so I booked a hotel room for the weekend and bought tickets online. It wasn't a luxury vacation by any means, just a modest celebration for a little boy who deserved to feel special on his birthday. Wesley was absolutely thrilled when I told him about the surprise. We had an amazing weekend. Wesley rode every ride he was tall enough for, ate way too much cotton candy, and fell asleep in the car clutching a stuffed animal he'd won at one of the games. Seeing his joy made every penny worth it. I posted a few pictures on social media because I was proud of being able to give my son such a memorable experience. That was my mistake. Within hours of posting those pictures, my phone was ringing. It was Francine, and she was absolutely furious. I cannot believe what I'm seeing, she said without even saying hello. You're taking that child on expensive vacations while claiming Blake doesn't pay enough child support? Do you realize how this looks? I was genuinely confused. What are you talking about, Francine? This was Wesley's birthday present. Birthday present, she scoffed. Hotels and theme parks? That must have cost hundreds of dollars. Meanwhile, my poor son is drowning in debt because of your demands for money he doesn't have. The irony was staggering. Blake's debt was accumulating because he refused to pay $30 a week, not because I was living some lavish lifestyle. But Francine had already decided on her narrative, and facts weren't going to change her mind. Are you seriously calling to criticize me for celebrating my son's birthday? I asked, unable to hide my disbelief. I'm calling because you're making Blake look like a deadbeat father while you're out there flaunting money that probably came from his pockets, she snapped. It's humiliating for him, and it's not fair to Wesley to create these unrealistic expectations. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The accusation was so absurd that laughter was my only defense against the pure audacity of what she was suggesting. Francine, I think you should probably stop calling me about this stuff, I said, still chuckling at the ridiculousness of her complaint. Wesley is my son, and how I choose to celebrate his birthday is really none of your business. I hung up, thinking that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text message that was so long it came through in multiple parts. Francine had apparently spent those 20 minutes crafting what she probably thought was a devastating takedown of my character. The message was a masterpiece of manipulation and victim blaming. She accused me of being a materialistic mother who cared more about creating Instagram moments than about the financial strain I was putting on her son. She claimed I was teaching Wesley to expect expensive gifts and experiences that his father couldn't afford, setting Blake up to look inadequate in comparison. You're playing games with a child's emotions just to make yourself look like the better parent, she wrote. Blake is suffering financially because of your greed, and now you're flaunting expensive trips like you're some kind of martyr mom. It's disgusting. The message went on, painting me as a vindictive ex-wife who was using the child support system to punish Blake while living beyond my means. According to Francine's version of events, I was simultaneously too poor to support Wesley on my own and too rich to deserve any help from his father. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and exhaustion. This was the same pattern that had destroyed my marriage, Blake's mother inserting herself into situations where she didn't belong and making accusations that had no basis in reality. But this time, I wasn't going to stay silent. I opened my phone's photo gallery and found 2 specific screenshots I'd saved months earlier. The first was a confirmation email from my hotel and theme park booking, showing the total cost of Wesley's birthday trip. The second was a summary from the CMS showing the total amount of child support I'd received in the past year. The contrast was stark and undeniable. The birthday trip had cost me $437, money I'd saved from my own paychecks over several months. The total child support received from Blake in 12 months was exactly $0.00. I attached both screenshots to a text message and added a simple question: "So did your poor son fund our trip, or did he actively participate in raising Wesley this past year? Can't really claim both, Francine. Pick a story, please." I hit send before I could second guess myself, then set my phone aside and tried to focus on helping Wesley with his homework. But my hands were shaking slightly as I realized I'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I'd stopped trying to keep the peace and started telling the truth instead. My phone started buzzing within minutes. First came a series of increasingly frantic messages from Francine, calling me manipulative and cruel. She accused me of attacking her when she was just trying to look out for her son's best interests. She claimed I was being unfair by throwing numbers in her face when she was only trying to have a reasonable conversation. "You know exactly what you're doing," she wrote. "You're trying to make Blake look bad by showing off your receipts. That's not about Wesley, that's about your ego." But the messages that really surprised me came from Blake himself. Apparently, his mother had immediately called him crying about how I'd ambushed her with evidence of his financial negligence. He was angry that I'd involved his mother in our child support issues, as if she hadn't been the one calling me to complain about them in the first place. "Why did you have to drag my mom into this?" he texted. "She was just trying to help, and you made her feel like garbage. This is between us, not her." The complete lack of self-awareness was breathtaking. Blake had been hiding behind his mother for years, letting her fight his battles and make his excuses. But the moment I provided actual facts instead of accepting their emotional manipulation, suddenly I was the one who'd crossed a line. "Blake, your mother called me to complain about Wesley's birthday trip," I replied. "She accused me of using your money for it. I simply showed her that you haven't contributed any money to show. She involved herself. You didn't have to humiliate her like that," he shot back. "You could have just explained the situation without being so harsh." I stared at that message in complete amazement. I'd been explaining the situation for over a year while Blake paid nothing toward his son's support. His mother had been calling me to complain and criticize my parenting choices for months. But somehow, showing them both concrete evidence of the reality was considered harsh. That's when I realized something that probably should have been obvious from the beginning. Blake and Francine didn't actually care about fairness or Wesley's best interests. They cared about maintaining a narrative where Blake was the victim and I was the unreasonable ex-wife making unreasonable demands. As long as I played along with that narrative, staying quiet and accepting their criticism, everything was fine. But the moment I provided evidence that contradicted their story, I became the villain. They were perfectly happy to have me carry the entire financial burden of raising Wesley as long as they could continue to portray Blake as a loving father who was being taken advantage of. The revelation was both liberating and exhausting. I'd spent years trying to keep the peace with these people, accepting their interference and criticism because I thought it was better for Wesley to maintain relationships with his father's side of the family. But I was finally understanding that my efforts to be accommodating had only enabled their toxic behavior. Over the next few days, both Blake and Francine continued to send messages expressing their outrage at my attack on their family. They claimed I was trying to poison Wesley against his father by documenting Blake's failure to pay support. They suggested I was being vindictive and cruel by refusing to work with them privately. But something had shifted in my perspective. Instead of feeling guilty about their anger, I felt clarity. I wasn't responsible for managing Blake's relationship with his son or protecting his reputation from the consequences of his own choices. I wasn't obligated to shield Francine from the reality of her son's behavior or accept her criticism of my parenting. Wesley deserved to have both parents contributing to his care, and if Blake chose not to fulfill that responsibility, the consequences were his to face. I wasn't being vindictive by expecting him to support his child. I was being a responsible parent. I decided to stop engaging with their messages entirely. Every text from Blake or Francine went unanswered. When Blake's father called to try to mediate the situation, I politely told him that all communication about child support should go through the official channels. "We're just trying to work something out as a family," he said, clearly frustrated by my refusal to negotiate. "Blake and I aren't family anymore," I replied. "We're co-parents with legal obligations to our son. The CMS exists for exactly this reason." The harassment continued for several more weeks, but I held firm. I blocked Francine's number after she left a voicemail calling me a heartless witch who was destroying her son's life. I stopped responding to Blake's attempts to guilt me into dropping the child support case. Instead, I focused on building a better life for Wesley and myself. I enrolled in evening classes to finish my master's degree. I started dating again, cautiously but optimistically. I bought us a small house in a neighborhood with good schools, using money I'd saved by being careful with every dollar. Wesley thrived in our new environment. Without the constant tension and criticism from his father's family, he became more confident and outgoing. His grades improved, and he made new friends in our neighborhood. He still saw Blake on weekends, but those visits became less frequent as Blake struggled to maintain even basic consistency in his son's life. The most telling moment came about 6 months after the screenshot incident. Wesley came home from a weekend with his father looking confused and a little sad. "Mom, why does Grandma Francine always ask me if you buy me expensive things?" he asked as I helped him unpack his overnight bag. I felt my jaw clench, but I kept my voice calm. "What kind of things does she ask about, honey?" "Like my new sneakers and my backpack for school. She wanted to know how much they cost and if you bought them with Dad's money." Wesley looked up at me with innocent eyes. I told her Dad doesn't give us money, but she said that wasn't true. That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected for months. Blake's family was trying to involve Wesley in their narrative about child support, attempting to make him feel guilty about the things I provided for him. They were willing to confuse and upset an 8-year-old child to avoid confronting the reality of Blake's negligence. I realized then that maintaining any relationship with Blake's extended family wasn't worth the cost to Wesley's emotional well-being. These people weren't interested in having a healthy relationship with their grandson. They wanted to use him as a weapon in their ongoing war against me. I made the decision to cut off all direct communication with Blake's parents. If they wanted to see Wesley, they would need to arrange it through Blake directly. I wouldn't be facilitating visits or maintaining relationships that had become toxic and harmful to my son. When I informed Blake of this decision, his response was predictably dramatic. He accused me of alienating Wesley from his grandparents and threatened to take me to court for interference with his parental rights. "You can't just cut my family out of Wesley's life because you're mad at my mom," he said during one of our rare phone conversations. "I'm not cutting anyone out of Wesley's life," I replied calmly. "I'm just no longer going to coordinate visits or communicate directly with your parents. If you want Wesley to see them, that's your responsibility as his father." Blake sputtered about how unfair this was, how I was making things difficult for everyone. But I'd finally learned that Blake's definition of fair was me doing all the work while he and his family received all the credit. I was done with that arrangement. The transformation in my life over the following months was remarkable. Without the constant stress of managing Blake's family's expectations and criticism, I had more energy to focus on the things that truly mattered. Wesley and I developed new traditions and made new memories without the shadow of judgment hanging over every decision. I stopped feeling guilty about the choices I made for my son. If I wanted to take him to a movie or buy him a new book, I didn't have to worry about Francine calling to accuse me of being frivolous with money that wasn't mine. If Wesley needed new clothes or school supplies, I bought them without sending Blake a detailed breakdown of costs that he would ignore anyway. The financial situation stabilized as well. The CMS continued to track Blake's debt, which had grown to several $1,000s with fees and interest. He occasionally found part-time work, and small amounts would be deducted from his paychecks, but it was clear that he had no intention of becoming a reliable source of support. I stopped caring about the money as much as I'd thought I would. Yes, it would have been helpful to have Blake contributing regularly to Wesley's expenses, but the peace of mind that came from not having to fight for every dollar was worth more than the actual payments. Wesley began to understand the dynamics of his family situation in age-appropriate ways. He still loved his father and grandparents, but he also recognized that our home was a place of stability and consistency that he couldn't find elsewhere. He stopped asking why his dad didn't come to school events or help with homework, accepting that different parents showed love in different ways. The most healing moment came almost a year after I'd sent those screenshots to Francine. Wesley and I were at his school's science fair, where he'd won second place for his project on solar energy. As we walked to the car carrying his ribbon and trophy, he looked up at me with a serious expression. "Mom, I'm really glad you're my mom," he said out of nowhere. "I'm really glad you're my son too, buddy." "What made you think of that?" Tommy's mom was asking Mrs. Peterson about science fair projects, and she said some parents do all the work for their kids. "But you just helped me when I asked questions and let me do the experiments myself." I felt tears prick my eyes as I realized what he was really saying. Wesley was learning to recognize the difference between supportive parenting and controlling behavior. He was developing his own sense of what healthy relationships looked like, and he felt safe and valued in the environment we'd created together. "That's what good moms do," I told him as I buckled his seatbelt. "They help their kids learn to do things for themselves." "Yeah," he agreed, already distracted by examining his trophy. "Dad's mom tries to do everything for everyone. It's kind of weird." Out of the mouths of babes. Even at 8 years old, Wesley could see what I'd taken years to recognize. Francine's behavior wasn't loving support, it was controlling interference that prevented the people around her from developing independence and confidence. Looking back now, I can see that the screenshot incident was a turning point not just in my relationship with Blake's family, but in my understanding of my own worth. For years, I'd accepted their criticism and manipulation because I thought keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself. But that day, when I chose to respond with facts instead of apologies, I discovered something powerful. The truth doesn't need to be defended or explained or softened. It simply is. And when people react with anger to the truth, that tells you everything you need to know about their relationship with reality. Francine wasn't angry because I'd been unfair or cruel. She was angry because I'd refused to continue participating in a narrative that painted her son as a victim of my unreasonable demands. She was angry because the evidence contradicted everything she'd been telling herself and others about why Blake wasn't supporting his child. Blake wasn't angry because I'd involved his mother. He was angry because his strategy of letting his mother fight his battles while he avoided responsibility had finally backfired. He was angry because he could no longer hide behind the excuse that child support was too expensive while I was supposedly living beyond my means. They were both angry because I'd stopped making their comfort more important than my own dignity and my son's needs. They were angry because I'd chosen honesty over harmony, and truth over toxic peace. That realization freed me from years of guilt and self-doubt. I wasn't responsible for managing other people's emotions or protecting them from the consequences of their choices. I wasn't obligated to accept criticism from people who contributed nothing positive to my life or my son's. Today, Wesley is thriving in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was still trying to maintain relationships with people who saw us as problems to be managed rather than people to be loved. He's confident, curious, and kind. He knows that he's valued and supported, even if that support comes primarily from one parent. Blake occasionally surfaces with promises to do better or complaints about how difficult I've made everything for him. But those conversations no longer have the power to upset me. I've learned to respond with facts rather than emotions, and to set boundaries that protect my peace and my son's well-being. Francine and I haven't spoken since that final exchange of messages. I occasionally hear through mutual acquaintances that she still portrays herself as the victim of my vindictive behavior, but her opinion no longer matters to me. She made her choice when she decided to prioritize protecting her son's ego over supporting her grandson's needs. The child support debt continues to grow, and Blake continues to avoid regular employment that would result in consistent payments. But I've built a life that doesn't depend on his contributions, and Wesley has learned that security comes from the people who show up consistently, not from the ones who make excuses. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd continued to accept Francine's interference and Blake's negligence in the name of keeping the peace. Would Wesley have grown up thinking that his needs were less important than everyone else's comfort? Would I have spent another decade apologizing for expecting basic responsibility from the people who should have been supporting us? I'm grateful I'll never have to find out. The day I sent those screenshots and chose truth over convenience was the day I started teaching my son that he deserves to be valued, supported, and respected. It was the day I stopped accepting less than I deserved and started building the life we both needed. That's the real lesson here. Not that revenge is sweet or that exposing someone's lies feels good, though both of those things might be true. The real lesson is that when you stop protecting other people from the truth about their behavior, you create space for authentic relationships built on respect rather than manipulation. Wesley and I have that kind of relationship now. We're honest with each other about our feelings and our challenges. We support each other without trying to control each other. We celebrate each other's successes without keeping score or asking what we deserve in return. And when he's older and starts building relationships of his own, he'll know what real love and support look like. He'll know that healthy relationships require honesty, consistency, and mutual respect. He'll know that his worth isn't determined by other people's willingness to acknowledge it. That knowledge is the most valuable gift I could ever give him, and it's worth more than any amount of child support Blake could have provided. In the end, teaching Wesley to value himself turned out to be more important than making his father value him. The screenshots I sent that day weren't really about money or revenge. They were about refusing to let other people's narratives define my reality. They were about choosing self-respect over self-sacrifice, and teaching my son that truth is always worth defending, even when it makes other people uncomfortable. I have no regrets about that choice. Wesley deserves a mother who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult. He deserves to learn that love isn't about keeping the peace at any cost, it's about creating environments where everyone can thrive authentically. And I deserve to be proud of the life we've built together, without having to justify every choice to people who contribute nothing but criticism. That's not selfish or vindictive. That's just healthy.